you so much. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Torin. He was a hero of mine when I was young, and I owe him a lot in terms of what I know, or I think I know, about context. Usually, you'd have to bear with me today because I'm still recovering from a very bad bout of vertigo. Usually, I'm much more energetic. Today, I will have to do a combination of sitting down, calmly, and standing up. Okay, so let me say what I see as the background of my talk. Identities in the early days of online communication, what used to be called computer-mediated communication, were very much linked with anonymity, okay? With people assuming all kinds of avatars, virtual personas, and perhaps being disinhibited because of that, and being somebody else. With the advent of social networking sites, what we now collectively call social media, we have had a decisive move away from that anonymity because if we take Facebook, it tends to reaffirm offline relationships. You tend to be friends with people that you also know. So this has created very porous boundaries between the online and offline. So we are online and we are still people. This has implications for some of the research on identities on social media. One of which is that, do I need this as well? I thought I had one, yeah?
You already have one?
Yeah. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Yes, yes. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Yeah? So, despite a lot of rhetoric of fluidity and experimentation with our identities on social media, last time I checked, Facebook gave UK users 21 options in terms of what their gender classification was. Despite all that, we do nowadays find that social media platforms are constructed as gendered and in binary terms platforms, okay, and B, lots of users actually communicate with perhaps demographic, binary, essentialist types of identities. So this is a typical social psychology result in terms of gender identities on social media, which in some ways reaffirms a binary, an essentialist binary. Social media research is a huge field, as I'm sure you know. Lots of sociological and cultural studies approaches to it. And within those studies, the emphasis so far has been on, despite the essentializing that we are nowadays finding, emphasis has been on the individual as an agentive user who actually uses marketing strategies. They apply to themselves, they brand themselves. A very well notion now. Identity says brand itself online. And at the same time, that subject premises their popularity on metricization and on all kinds of metrics, numbers of likes, numbers of shares of their posts. There's quite a bit of research here that tells us how popular subjects are constituted by using self-branding strategies. If we look at a kind of an emerging focus of that type of research, it's definitely moving a little bit away from the agentive, celebratory, individual, self-branded subjects to recognizing that, of course, a lot of what we do in terms of us and our identities online is very much linked with algorithms and what they think we should be doing or who they think we are, okay? And algorithms, of course, algorithms are trained, and new algorithms are trained on the back of old algorithms. And what we find with algorithms, they're not neutral processing systems. They are hugely ideologically laden systems. And we find that they come with all kinds of biases and assumptions. So they anticipate us. This is what my algorithm think I am or I should be doing. I think they've got it wrong on both counts. They anticipate us, but this is not just a unidirectional thing. Algorithms anticipate, create certain positions for us, but we are also somehow informed by those positions. We are prepositioned and we somehow take up maybe some of that positioning. Now, let's look at, I'm just in a very crude way because it's a daunting literature, but I'm just giving you some pointers in the literature that I have been navigating with as well. And if we look at what sociolinguists, for instance, have done in terms of language and identities, language, of course, mostly it's multimodality, multisemiosis. However, we do find a focus in sociolinguistics still on language, and there's a lot of work. I've produced some lovely photographs of beautiful people here who have done lots of work on creativity, on vernacular creativity. So literally looking at users online in terms of, again, agentive, creative, people who use more or less strategically, ironically, playfully, all those new genres and styles that they have, okay? Now, if we assess the prime foci of sociolinguistics and cultural perspectives, sociological, cultural perspectives on social media, I think what we are seeing very little of still, to my liking, is a view of identities, a more holistic view of identities as assemblages that definitely recognizes the multisemioticity and that definitely recognizes the interplay between users' actual communicative practices. This is topical, actually. Those young women were here in Spain. I don't know if you can see it in España with those beautiful chicas. So that's a very typical selfie posting. I was looking at selfies at that point. And my view in terms of how then we can approach identities is that we definitely need to take into account this interplay between the app's own design, the algorithms, the affordances, and by affordances I mean the perceived by actual users possibilities for action, but also constraints. This is something that I'm finding there's not much focus on yet within sociolinguistic and discourse studies. We have to take into account the actual users' multisemiotic communicative choices. There's not much focus on this within sociological, cultural studies perspectives on social media. And we definitely need to see identities very much bound up with participation, interaction, and I would add ways of making, developing, distributing stories, okay? Plot, how we implode on social media ourselves, our lives, and the world around us. Focal to these two, I find the notion of identities as intimately linked with the cultural, app-designed economy of sharing. So I look at identities closely linked with sharing lives, with a directive to users to share lives in the here and now, in the moment, okay? And to do so, I bring together in my work in ways that I'm not going to be able to talk about in any detail here, because I will kind of zoom into one specific kind of analysis that I'm doing at this point here. But just for you to have a little bit of an overview of where I'm coming from, I bring together microanalytical online conversation analysis methods with digital ethnography, but I'm also taking into account a genealogical approach to media platforms themselves that sees them as major actors, socio-material, technical actors that actually influence communication online. They are not neutral spaces, okay? We don't go there with super agency in terms of what we can do or what we cannot do. Now, my analysis, it follows on from my work on small stories on social media, has attested to brevity, fragmentation, open-endedness, multisemioticity, and multi-authorship as common features of stories on social media. But I've also been involved in a project with very nice colleagues at the English department at King's. It's an ERC project, and look us up if you want. There's all kinds of resources. It's a multidisciplinary team. And my starting point in this project was the built-in an economy, as I said, of sharing breaking news in many social networking sites. And this is definitely linked with the algorithmically shaped preference for recency of posts, or at least it was at that point. So 10 years ago, recency was a main factor in terms of sharing on Facebook, and it is, and other social networking sites, and it is notably still. We don't know very much about algorithms. They are opaque, but Facebook does put out every now and then snippets about how their algorithms work. Now, recency is notably one of the three weight factors in Facebook's algorithm, which is called EdgeRank. So I have shown in other work how this built-in economy of breaking news ultimately serves as a directive to users for sharing their everyday life as stories, however short, incomplete, and unreflected upon. And you might ask, what if they don't take up that prompt? Well, not taking up this prompt comes with a cost to users' metricized popularity. Again, I have shown in some of my work how this is the case with a focus on young women's modes of self-representation, in particular selfies on Facebook and Instagram. And my work so far has unraveled specific, normative, and systematic ways in which media affordances, mediated by algorithmic manipulation of users' data, actually shape users' communication practices for this branded directive of living and telling, okay? Key methods for the selection of data in my project so far have included, and again, I'm hoping I'll have time to say a bit more about these things this afternoon. But very quickly, I'll say that obviously I've done a lot of real-time tracking of changes on platforms. I've done quite a bit of reflexive research in terms of my own media engagements, as well as deploying the app's own modes of observations, and in fact, metricization of activities as a way of identifying key actors. I have done lots of ethnographic observations of pre-post sharing activities, and a lot of microanalysis, which is in tune with what I've been working on for a number of years. But I have lately complemented the microanalysis of my data sets with a corpus-assisted narrative analysis of published surveys, platform blogs, including any publicity about new features for stories on social media and reviews of such features. I started off qualitatively with 110 articles that I pulled from the 10 top online tech magazines. I don't know if you ever read those things: Wired, TechCrunch, Mashable, CNET, TechJuice. They are the kind of the Bibles of tech people. But I expanded this to create a corpus that I'll say something about in the next slide. I view this material as actually very important, a sort of paratext, but para doesn't mean unimportant. Para is in Genette's way of talking about paratext as a very integral part of the complex mediation between algorithms, affordances, discourses of media platforms and users' practices. So this combination of perspectives is allowing me to undertake a more critical approach to social media affordances and to identify discourses of how memories, in some other work, and stories, which is what I'm going to focus on today, have been viewed and defined, and how they connect with the imperative of sharing the moment. Okay, so I have identified in my work very briefly three pivots, three key design phases on the so-called ego-centered media apps. And I include, even reluctantly, Facebook in this, because it has to be. It has to be the giant of ego-centered media apps. I include Instagram, which was tellingly acquired by Facebook in 2012. I include Snapchat. I don't know if, are you in Snapchat? Raise your, if you're over 25 and you're not on Snapchat, don't feel guilty about it at all. But it is the third most popular app for under 25s. And my genealogical approach to these ego-centered apps shows that about 10 years ago, when Facebook prompt was, "What are you doing right now?" there was a directive to users to share the moment now. And my analysis shows that that actually meant that stories, small stories, in statuses, okay, and lives were literally shared as breaking news, okay? Just now, I have just, and breaking news, not just for disruptions, but also to announce the mundane. I have just had a delicious curry, okay? So it was all, and some corpus analysis of that time actually also shows that temporal adverbials of just immediacy was very, very important in postings, okay? Now, we moved from that to facilities, Foucault would call them technologies of the self, for actually showing the moment. So you don't just share the moment textually, and I'll show examples in the afternoon of users moving from a very textual sharing of the moment with lots and lots of words to a very visual sharing of the moment, which, of course, the height of that was selfies, okay, as prime technologies of self, which in fact, in my ethnographic work with young women, the early adopters of selfies, they migrated their selfies from Facebook. They started with Facebook, but they migrated them to Instagram quite soon. From there on, we have moved to a third, post-2015, to a third phase, a third pivot, okay, for evolving technologies of the self, which is what I will focus on today, which is about a story designing spree, I call it spree, across apps, particularly those three that I have mentioned, where they offer facilities for sharing your moments as stories. They very openly and categorically offer story facilities, and they call those features stories as well. So I'm very interested in this move, in this shift from actually curating the subject. You know, remember in the early slides, we talked about the subject as a self-branded individual, to curating stories. So it's becoming more about your stories as opposed to about you. So I'm interested in, what does this curation actually mean for identities? First of all, the first question I think to address, to answer this, is what definitions and views of stories, you know, what discourses, if you want, of stories underpin those features that are designed as story features on apps? What facilities are on offer, and how are stories being branded? Branding is an important concept to use here, because it is about attaching specific social values to stories, which in many ways, I will argue, in the next 5-10 minutes, in many ways, are actually reconfiguring social values and definitions traditionally and historically attached to stories. So I'm continuing with this question, with this line of inquiry, because I'm very interested in who is discursively constructed and positioned then as a good storyteller on social media apps, an audience, what roles and identities are attached to them, and in fact, what implications does this have for the kinds of lives and subjectivities that become much more visible, much more widely available, much more amplified, because they may become viral, yeah? And what is silenced then? What remains hidden, untold, unshared? Never say told nowadays, say unshared. So this is the story's designing spree that I have in mind. In some of my work, I have looked at memories on Facebook as an antecedent, because I also work with the concepts of, trust me, to spoil the games here. I have also worked with the concept of remediation. So I'm very interested in how communication activities from other contexts, face-to-face contexts, are remediated online. So memories need to be examined as a precursor to the story designing spree that brings those apps together. Now, I have done some corpus-assisted analysis, as I said, and let me see. Let me just give you, to complement some critical qualitative story-based analysis that I had done on 110 articles. I thought, I have written critically elsewhere about the use of big data and the dataification of subjects. I don't see this corpus work as big data in any ways. They're still very small data if you ask big data people, right? But I do see a synergy of, broadly speaking, qualitative, quantitative modes of analysis in a recursive fashion as quite productive. Particularly with online data, partly because of some methodological challenges that they pose, which I'll talk about in the afternoon. So, interestingly, this corpus compilation, for which I have had amazing help from my research assistant, Anna Dražovian, has come up, I call it a zooming in, because it literally is checking further with more data, specific qualitative observations that I had made, for instance, about the close association of stories as features on apps with time and immediacy and moments. we've made quite a few decisions here that are presented to you as, oh, these are the decisions that we made, this is what we've got, perfect. There was a lot of back and forth. For instance, and I don't have time to talk about the trial and error, the decisions we made, the challenges that we had for every single decision. For instance, we really wanted to avoid the bias of Google search histories, okay? We really wanted to avoid that, and we used a couple of other search engines. Did we avoid it in the end? Not necessarily, not exclusively. At least we did our best by bringing in a couple of more search engines, okay? And we ended up doing the kind of normal corpus analysis, concordances, keywords, key semantic domains, multi-keywords. And this analysis, in combination with my previous analysis of how communicative practices around sharing stories have evolved on social media, and my smaller scale qualitative analysis of material about stories, you know, how are stories launched, what do the apps themselves say, has actually shown that there are quite a lot of tensions, you know, I call them mismatches, and by mismatches I mean tensions, trade-offs, glitches between the rhetoric. You could call it, I suppose, if you're a critical discourse analyst, I do sometimes hesitate to say capital D discourse, but it is really in this case about the discourses, the own media apps and their machinery, okay, their corporate machine discourse about stories, the offerings, the actual offerings, the affordances, okay, and the communicative practices of actual users. And this, I repeat, has implications for what kinds of identities become visible or invisible. Okay, let me talk you through what I see as the first big mismatch, which goes back to memories on Facebook. Stories are very much branded and introduced as activities that allow you, the user, to go beyond the single feed, the here and now, the tyranny of the moment, and to present yourself with some continuity over time, okay? And there's a lot of, you can share now, not just a moment, but all your moments, your day, your life. Now, this sounds very good, doesn't it? But the reality of it is very different. And the reality of it is that actually stories as features are very much built on that economy that I talked about of sharing the moment now. So recency and ephemerality are big factors. A couple of studies have already shown to us how and why people cannot do collective remembering on Facebook well. They can't do it well because the app prioritizes recency and ephemerality, okay? So, and it has to do with whose posts you're seeing as well. You know, they go very quickly, posts that are not prioritized, and also posts that are not about the here and now. So essentially, even when you share memories on Facebook, it's about past moments. They're pulled out, algorithmically pulled out, and flagged up for the here and now. So a big mismatch between this promised continuity and in fact the close association of stories with the unit of moment on the one hand and with posts either previous or current within a platform. And in fact, you know, Snapchat stories, of course you can say, how many of you have posted or viewed stories on Snapchat or on Instagram? And again, quite a bit. You know, they're very popular. They're hugely, I mean, I should have given some stats. First of all, teenagers are 4 times more likely because this is the target audience, and I'll say something about what this means in terms of identities. The target audience are, let's get this straight, of these companies, the millennials, which is a very broad category now, because it literally, I can see lots of people in the room saying, oh, I'm a millennial, I'm very young, because it literally covers people from the 80s onwards, but actually, particularly Instagram and Snapchat, I have bad news for the millennials. They're not very interested in the millennials anymore. They're very interested in the so-called Generation Z. And Generation Z literally covers my daughter's and my son's generation, people who were born after mid-90s, okay? Now, those people, particularly women, it goes back to this idea that, fluidity on social media, yet we do time and again, all the surveys point to very conventional, binary, gendered ways of using those big apps, okay? So, women under 24 are 4 times more likely than people over 24 to post stories on Snapchat until recently. And now, of course, Instagram, which literally cloned Snapchat stories, has overtaken 300 million active story posters are in our globe every day, okay? So hugely popular feature. But going back to this idea of continuity versus recency, so Snapchat stories, for instance, remain live for 24 hours and then they disappear, okay? You can save your stories nowadays, but they are literally also small stories, 10 seconds long. And people have tried, to break the limits of Instagram, and apparently you can't go beyond 100 clicks or something. So there are limits as to how sustained and continuous this activity is. And putting together stories to go beyond the moment is therefore still done, and this is where I think the interest for us from a communication point of view is, in ways that allow for aggregative compilations of moments in the present, rather than for reflective and perhaps highly selective reconstructions of past events. This, as I've said, has implications for how features that promise more sustained story activities can be taken by users, and research on memories is one example of that. In similar vein, our analysis of the key semantic domains suggests that immediacy is a salient theme in the corpus. And it didn't surprise me in view of my prior qualitative work as well. And this is mainly supported by the importance of the lexeme moments in the corpus, which is associated with sharing and capturing instants of one's day and doing things, living, being in the moment. So in a way, and if we look at these 3 semantic categories for modifiers or for the moment, moments are very much associated with spontaneity and the mundane, reinforcing the deployment of stories for sharing the everyday as it happens, okay? Now, the second mismatch is about the fact that the label, and it has become a label really, stories, evokes conventional definitions of reminiscing and telling stories in other environments, particularly in this case, stories we tell our friends about us and our past. Do you see the Generation Z there in template stories? That's who is positioned as the ideal storyteller, and I'll say in a minute what storyteller actually means. So the power of stories for connecting with others is constantly referenced in the blogs, in the launching documents of these features by the CEOs, product managers, all of the material which we have looked at and we have included in our corpus. However, the rest of the language that describes memories in my previous work and stories now, the template stories that are offered, the actual facilities, designate stories as postings with photos and videos. They're therefore stories offered as a consolidation. If you remember the slide about the 3 pivots, of the second pivotal design phase of showing the moment. And they literally serve as a bridge, I think, for the next phase, which is already upon us, and that's that of live video. What happens to language and text? When I present this work to a kind of more purist, sociolinguists or discourse analysts, they always, some of them, what has happened to language? You ask me as well. What has happened to language and text is that they are increasingly confined to brief, evaluative captions, ideally to be accompanied by emojis. Visual posts, let's not forget, count as algorithmically priority posts. So it is fair to assume, because again this speaks to how free users are to do their own thing. And they're not entirely free, because it is fair to assume that this serves as incentive for users to actually comply with the promoted visuality of their stories. The more visual their posts are, the more chances they have of being liked, viewed, and so on. And of course, it consolidates the metricization of stories, adding yet another metric of success to the long-standing one of liking, so how many users have viewed your story. So the mismatch between the branding of stories and the affordances offered for them is also attested to in the parallel uses of these 2 lexemes, stories with a capital S and stories, small s, as 2 distinct and differentially defined activities. So in the corpus, the former was found to refer to the engineered up feature that comes with specific affordances, while the latter, often prefaced by the pronouns my and your, evoked conventional definitions of stories that users are expected to be familiar with from other environments. Stories in the plural was capitalized by 200% compared to stories, small s, while story, you can see, was 50% more frequent than story, capital S. And capital S stories are important for this second mismatch, notably collocated with a visual language a lot more, show, watch, view, hide, while stories and story, small s, strongly collocate with tell, and as I will show in a minute, with the theme of creativity. These are important little findings. I'm almost sold on corpus analysis on this thing. I've got my misgivings, as long as you complement it with other things. But what's important about these findings is that we see a redesignation of stories as visual rather than textual communication. And this has implications. It goes back to my idea of curating stories goes hand in hand with curating specific subjects, specific storytellers, for how storytellers and audiences are positioned too. So storytellers become creators and viewers of their own stories, and audience in turn become primarily viewers. This places a premium on specific narratorial positions. If we look at narrative theory, this places a premium on the narrator who experiences, as opposed to the narrator who can step back and reflect on the goings-on. I'm not saying that one is better or worse than the other. In fact, in my work, I have argued that we shouldn't privilege one too much. But I'm saying that it's important that there is a whole engineering of stories that actually places emphasis on I seeing, on the sensory eye. I'm seeing now, I'm hearing now, I'm recording now, I'm experiencing now, and I'm the narrator as well. Okay? And the privileging of these sensory roles for the narrator recorder, ultimately, of daily life becomes part of a key semantic domain in the features of stories, that of visuality. And also we find a lot of language now of watching TV series or film language being adapted in the facilities. For instance, you can hide your stories, you can watch them, you can mute them, you can rewind them. And what is notable in the corpus as well is that most of the sensory, visual verbs position the user as a consumer. And this really tallies with the marketing purposes of stories, and it adds to the overall mismatch between stories as a feature and the rhetoric that stories as a label evoke. Let me move to the third and last key mismatch. And this involves the rhetoric of personalization for users, which highlights that they are in a position to control their stories and their content creators. This is very much at odds with the high level of, really, I'm using the term here standardization, and I'm not using it lightly, with the high level of standardization with which stories come, especially in terms of preselections. A key linguistic element of personalization in the corpus involves the unusual frequency, because we have our reference corpus as well, the web corpus, N1010, as I showed in a previous slide. And so the second person pronoun, you, is unusually frequent in our corpus. It's approximately 4 times more frequent than I, and your is about 10 times more frequent than mine. It's about your story, right? The salience of you and your could be partly explained by the fact that many of the articles are how-to guides, okay? Therefore, they contain lots of indications and procedural sequences to the users. But at the same time, the analysis of you collocates suggests a strong association between you, if conditionals, and models. You can, essentially. All these categories are also salient keywords, okay? And the fact that they also collocate suggests an emphasis in the discourse of apps about stories on the choices, okay? Choices. You've got choice. You are the content creator. You are in a position of choice. At the same time, of course, choices in the corpus as well seem to be restricted to predefined options or scenarios that allow specific, and you can see how to is the second most salient n-gram, because literally lots of these texts are produced as how-to guides, how to do stories. Users are constantly given predefined options or scenarios that allow specific courses of action in specific circumstances, okay? So possibility and choice in the rhetoric, but actually quite restricted choices, individual choices in the actual affordances, and lots of pre-selections and templates. I don't know if you've ever used those filters. So you've got all kinds of boomerang, flipograms, augmented reality filters. Stories come with an abundance of tools. Now, the theme of possibilities for users through stories is also closely linked with another salient theme in the corpus, that of creativity and originality. So keywords and phrases such as create, creative, much creativity, creating content, get creative, indicate emphasis on using the story's feature creatively and on being authentic and original. And this is certainly how stories were initially promoted by Instagram. The phrase much creativity occurs 29 times in the corpus, and every single time it's the result of a citation, okay? A citation of Instagram's own announcement. And of course, creativity collocates with the term story in association with those possessive modifiers. What's important here from these collocates and numbers is how we get again this positioning of posters of stories as both creators of content, and when they're creators of content, they are actually called tellers, storytellers, yeah, the power of stories being evoked again, and as users and consumers of a curated feature. And so we find this tension between productive, personalizing, and curated roles very much in the collocations of the keyword creative, okay? So this shows to us the coexistence of creativity that suggests choice and control for the storyteller with designed pre-selection facilities, which ultimately restrict choice. Because if you have used stories, you will know that you can adjust privacy settings, you can turn notifications on and off, you can add filters, but you are constantly presented with choices from a menu, and the tools here are constantly evolving, and they're bespoke graphics. They allow you to become a filmmaker for the day, but it's very, very difficult to produce interesting and fun stories if you say, oh, I'm not using any of those. I'll do my own individual thing, okay? Now, why are these mismatches in play? What do they tell us about the direction of travel in relation to designing stories on media apps at this point? Mismatches occur as stories seem to attempt to fulfill the dual and often competing goals of design and algorithmic maximization. So this curation phase of stories draws, as we saw, on familiar views and positive associations of stories with personal creativity and connection with others through sharing experiences, ideally experiences with a temporalized element. And this branding makes stories an attractive format in the quest of apps for serving as hubs, which actually keep the users hooked and their attention economy there in that particular app. What better way for it than providing facilities that encourage users to present themselves with some continuity? Jose van Dijk, if you've read her work, observes a similar thing about Facebook and LinkedIn. But with stories, media companies also appear to be taking a further step towards the increasing algorithmic micro-targeting of users with advertisements. Okay? This is seen as a more accurate, personalized, and compelling way of advertising than the algorithmic anticipation that has so far relied on working out who we are from what we click on, what we like, and what we share. So with this, with stories, we seem to be witnessing a time at which social media are following a path of increasing commodification. The earlier emphasis of apps on individuals presenting themselves as brands, with which I started this talk, seem, for instance, with edited selves on profile, with selfies and all that, seems to be moving to making user stories a brand. Ultimately, stories can provide a more personalized route to advertising too. Bringing advertising stories, advertising brands as stories and making story ads part of our experience can be a very powerful device for promoting products. This explains the huge success of stories as a feature among celebrities. And I won't have time because I don't want to talk for too long. I want to move to the conclusions quickly. I won't have time, but we can discuss Kim if you want to. I have been tracking Kim Kardashian. I've been tracking the Kardashians a little bit in terms of their so-called improper fame, and especially Kim in terms of her transition from a TV reality celebrity to a social media influencer and an early adopter. She is one of the most followed celebrities, as you can see on Instagram. Her stories change the pecking order a little bit. So her stories are not amongst the most viewed stories. But I have tracked her use of stories as a vehicle for, on a personal level, for what I call managing her hypervisibility a kind of narcissistic hypervisibility that had been associated with selfies, with her and selfies and belfies and whatever else, and managing a move to authenticity, which very much works with the discourse of stories. Stories are very much put forward as, you can be authentic now, you can do imperfect sharing, you don't need to have glossy lives. But what's interesting in her case and in the case of other influencers, celebrities, is how stories as a vehicle really blur the boundaries between this is me in my daily life, and I post things about my daily life, and this is me and my products. So they blur this boundary that I was talking about between personal life and actually advertising in a very, judging by the numbers of users who follow those influencers in more or less effective ways, okay? Let me move to the conclusion. I set out in this talk to address the question of what definitions and views of stories underpin and identities underpin the increasing offering of story features on apps. Who is positioned as an ideal story creator and audience of those stories, and why? And I specifically focused on stories on Instagram and Snapchat, although I did say that there's a wider story designing spree going on. My analysis of the launching of these app features, including a corpus-based keyword analysis and identification of lexical and thematic associations for the terms story, stories, made apparent both a convergence, they are replicated stories, on how they're conceptualized across apps, and also on what kinds of affordances are offered for them. And I also presented 3 key mismatches to you in terms of how these stories are branded and what the actual offerings are for them. Despite the promise of unlimited user control and creativity, actually sharing stories comes, as I said, with pre-selections, prior categorizations of experience, templates and menus with specific editing features. And I did say that these mismatches can be accounted by the increasing links of story curation with the social media move towards monetized, advertising-linked design. Now, if we take into account the media affordances of distribution and amplification, I think we can safely assume that the curation of stories will be instrumental in creating normative ways of being and storing oneself. And I think the convergence and replication of story facilities across apps also suggests that sharing those pre-packaged, pre-selected lives in the moment will become further consolidated as the autobiographical, and I use autobiographical in a loose way here, mode of choice and availability, particularly for the main targeted groups of young adults. So we may reach a definition, a time, it may sound a bit dystopian, but we may reach a point at which 20 years from now, at which there will be a whole generation or two for whom, I don't know, stories by the campfire will mean nothing, okay? Stories as actually you tell stories, maybe, who knows if they have come back in vogue and they're a cool thing. But I think what's important at the moment is that the marketing of stories already makes specific assumptions about what is story-worthy. So in particular, template stories offered by the apps, and you saw a couple of examples, are about sharing moments of having fun with friends. And the features that enhance the story's plot involve adding weather, location, holidays, funny sunglasses. That doesn't describe my life, but I'm not a primary targeting audience. Users are encouraged to create goofy selves, to do imperfect sharing. So story design seems to have taken on board the backlash from posting on Facebook, glossy, perfect lives, those lives that make us feel really envious about ours, and the moral panic, which I've written about in some of my work, about females, young females posting selfies and how narcissistic that is. So in this way, stories come with a promise of authenticity, strip it all down, keep it real, as a way of dealing with the backlash from earlier facilities of showing the moment. However, the mismatches that I reported here show to us that the directive to keep it real becomes well integrated. No, Facebook is not changing. Yeah, I've got news for you. It's not changing. No, it's becoming worse. It's becoming integrated into the well-established metricization and attention economy of apps. Stories really become part of a quantified self-presentation. Yes, you can have audience selection. Sometimes, some of my students say, but you can select friends now. You can include 10 friends by mentioning your story, and you can make your ratified addressees. True, yes, but I say that the dilemmas of audience selection versus audience reach persist as stories vie for uptake and viewings from friends and followers. And as they become intertwined with complex metrics, which include not just numbers now, but also completion, viewing completion figures, You don't want to be swiped, effed. Overall, any further curation to stories can be expected to continue to navigate this slippery ground between the provision of so-called meaningful, personalized content, which will maximize users' attention within an app, and the monetization of lives, which will capitalize on that intention. So there's something circular in this already. This deployment of stories in processes of subject making, we could say that since the turn of the millennium, in Western contexts of neoliberalization, is not something new. There's a nice book by Fernandez, Curating Stories, that talks about how stories are mobilized in legislation, production and circulation of stories in legal hearings, all the way to electoral processes and voter canvassing, and how there is a self-help industry that commoditizes stories to this effect. And her view, with which I agree, is that this ultimately, because it mostly involves scripted performances, it literally reduces the vastness of narrative practices and the fullness and complexity of individual experiences. She's talking about Malala, for instance, and how her story, how stories of specific individuals, traumatized individuals, abused individuals, disenfranchised, have to become legible for the Western mainstream, okay, with dominant tropes. So stories on media apps, as discussed here, I would say need to be placed in such contexts of neoliberalization, where stories have been refashioned since the turn of the millennium, ultimately within a business model, okay, to bring capital to organizations. However, what I would add, and what I think this work is adding to, is that it is in that close association of stories with the social media economy of sharing with which I started. This allows the commoditization of stories to take a much decisive step further than the self-help industry of globally available training toolkits and protocols because of media affordances. Because of the amplification, the availability, and the use of specific affordances and practices that are becoming available for large numbers of social media users around the globe to narrate selves. on a dark note, and I don't want to end on a very dark note, but on a dark note, my fear is that the pre-selection and iterativity of ready-made scenarios of how to live your life and who to be and when to emote and how to emote and what to think about and what is a story-worthy event or moment, and the portability, the brevity and portability of those things, the easy distribution. There is a fear, I have a fear, that they may render the potential for individual story creativity and uniqueness more difficult. In any case, I think the rebranding and refashioning of stories on social media is something that really merits further critical attention at this point, and I would expect, and I expect that there are lots of critical discourse analysts in this room, and I would expect critical discourse analysts to actually take up this opportunity and this challenge. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We open now time for discussion, for questions.
Yes.
Anybody who wants to make a comment, suggestion? Welcome. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask about affordances, because you were talking about affordances which people use, but I wanted to ask you about not like the general audience that you were studying, adolescents, but for instance, how creative people use Instagram stories, and sometimes I was thinking that sometimes the branding is not only about corporations, but how people brand themselves. For instance, I'm basing my question on my experience of using Instagram stories, and I have a lot of illustrators, cosplayers,
Yes.
and other fans activities. Maybe they are not mainstream activities, but there are a lot of varieties of them. Photographers, art galleries, then we have booktubers. And what do you think about these creative uses of the platform with these affordances that Instagram already have?
Yes. No, very good question. This is a kind of written up paper. Thank you for this question. The last paragraph, I read a little bit of that, but the very last paragraph is, I suppose, I hope, some kind of an answer to what you're saying. So what I'm saying in the last paragraph, which I didn't read, was that this is not to suggest that practices based on story features will not present contextual and individual variation in how different users may take them up. In fact, that's where I'm redeeming myself, my own work so far has focused on user story practices, and it is clear that there is sociolinguistically conditioned as well, potential in them, both for strategizing and for resisting media apps engineering, and I refer to a couple of these articles. This is where I become a little dystopic again, if you allow me, and this is how I think I'll finish this article, which is going to be published in Linguistics and Education. Individual users' creative practices notwithstanding, though, the level of standardization and monetary commoditization of stories, which I have reported here, merits further critical attention if we are to understand fully the place of stories in the social media construction of lives and selves. Now, let me add a footnote to what I've just said. I agree that there's potential for creative people who are not part of the mainstream to use Instagram and to post stories. The problem about apps such as Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat to a lesser degree historically, is amplification, as I said, metricization, popularity, and a culture of the winner takes it all. So the potential of amplified story formats, the potential of people following those story formats for creating literally, you know, what 10, 20 years ago we said in relation to printed media, you know, dominant accounts, you know, dominant mainstream accounts, discourses, and we always ask the question, how do you know? Now the potential on social media for dominant discourses, mainstream discourses and conceptualizations of stories is huge, is unprecedented, just because of the very fact that, as Dana Boyd has often said, what gets amplified on social media is not necessarily what should be amplified, or worse, what is intended to be amplified. And we cannot stop that easily. So that's where I suppose I'm taking more of a pessimistic view on the engineering of stories. But of course, what you're saying is also right, that there are users who can do all kinds of interesting things within the standardization of stories. A little bit like, you know, creative language speakers with standard languages. Yeah? You can do some style shifting, you can do some register hybridity, but when you go to take an exam at school, those are not going to go a long way. So when you want to be a really popular, amplified subject on Instagram, those creativities may not go a long way either. And Kim Kardashian will always be more followed. Yeah?
No, I don't need them. Thank you for your informative talk. It was really informative. My question is, I really liked your phrase that stories are actually quantized self-definitions. And the whole talk was really informative about the branding, the concept of branding about stories. So it's a personal experience. My question is, do you observe major alterations of storytelling styles in distinct cultures? Let's say individuals from very different parts of the world. Do you observe major differences in the ways of storytelling due to their cultural backgrounds? If so, do companies develop strategies specifically for monetizing those stories specifically? If not, if the observation is that every individual, the storytelling of every individual in the world is converging to a standard way, one standard way, can we talk about we are developing a virtual literature or virtual culture?
It's a good question. It's a very ambitious question. I mean, it literally is beyond, not the scope of this paper only, but beyond of what I could single-handedly set out to explore. And in fact, at the end of my talk, when I said, you know, these activities, these story practices really merit further critical attention, that's partly the kind of work I have in mind that needs to be done by lots and lots of people with access as well to different cultures. If we are going to look at actual users practices and how they take up stories around the world, that's great. I think with this, and I'm sure it will be revealing, and I'm sure we will be able to say something about the extent to which, and by osmosis, I feel that there is a kind that stories are now being redeployed as a kind of a global genre. But this is speculative. The reality is I haven't done it, and I wouldn't have been in a position to do this kind of ambitious work. So I would expect then Instagram users around the world to perhaps be localizing or globalizing, but within a frame of standardization that is provided by those, monopoly types of apps. But certainly, and I would also like to see something else that would interest me very much, and we've got lots of Chinese students in London, and of course their platforms, their media platforms are very, very different, and I would like to see if there is a similar move, say on Weibo, towards offering facilities not just for single post feeds, which was the initial history of offerings on Facebook and other social networking sites, but towards offering stories. I'd be very interested to see to the extent to which this is not just a Western, neoliberal move that builds on the already existing refashioning of stories. Yeah.
Could you make a brief description of the corpus? Because the fact that I and you are very frequent here in the corpus, and if you're talking about stories, I'm an old-fashioned storyteller in Facebook, for example.
Yeah.
And I think I have never used the word story in my stories. It's just to have an idea on the kind of selection you have made of the posts and who are these the storytellers you're using here in the corpus.
No, there are no storytellers. The corpus is a meta corpus about stories. It's everything, is all the blogs, launching documents by Instagram, Snapchat, about stories, all the reviews of we did extensive searches, and we have a temporal element as well, and it seems that this talk about stories, not actual use of stories, right? This talk about stories begins at around 2014, 2015. It peaks in 2016 when Instagram launches stories as a feature, but then we have constant updates. So this was trying to look at what I call the paratext, to look at the media, the own media apps and companies and their key actors within those companies discourse about stories as a feature. How do they talk about them? How do they launch them? The tech magazines, because there is a clear line between media apps and online tech magazines. So every time anything new is produced, tech magazines online will write reviews about it. Okay, we'll write presentations, for the users, and we'll write reviews about it. In the process, we also found a proliferation exactly like we were told, I was told years ago in sociolinguistics, standardization, Haugen, the 4 stages. I don't know if you remember that. How do we standardize a language? First we select it, then we codified it, then we elaborate its functions. So we have found online a lot of literally style manuals, what I would call style manuals and guides, how-to guides, how to post a great story. So the storytellers are addressed, okay? The potential storytellers are addressed with this.
In a sense, it would be instructional discourse then.
There's a lot of, I think I said procedural and instructional. A lot of our texts are procedural and instructional. Hence, in terms of titles, the second most frequent titles of the material that we have, the second most frequent engram is how to. So actually, a big part of the corpus is guides, how to guides.
Hey, sort of a 2-part question. One is as far as, so you talk about this corpus that mainly consists of how-to guides. Do you have any sense of who is the audience of this corpus, and does it align with the audience of Snapchat users, or is the under 25 Snapchat user looking up these guides, or is that a different audience? And if not, where are, particularly, I mean, sort of the implication of this claim that there's a standardized template and that's leading it to a more homogeneous story, implies that the majority of storytellers are being influenced more by these sort of templates or this marketing than they are by their sort of intermediate friends at school who might be telling them how to use Snapchat or Instagram, which also sort of goes against this echo chamber effect of social media, recently studied quite a bit. Yeah. So just like if you could put those two things in context.
Yeah. Okay, so we have to take into account in this the different levels, right? So there is a level of branding and discourse. There is also a level of affordances, actual offerings, okay? And of course, there's a level of actual communicative practices. Even the best of, who was it who said, even the best of sociological work can never look at all those three things in all of their complexity at the same time, and you need to do some bracketing. What I've done for this article is a little bit of bracketing. I mean, I essentially come from, if you want, the door of actually looking at micro-communities of practice, of users, particularly adolescent users, and how they engage and take up specific features. Selfies was a big one. With this one, I specifically zoomed into the interanimation between branding and affordances, okay? So the affordances, the actual choices, possibilities, the socio-material choices, what you see as a user and what you can do are definitely aimed at a specific generation of people and a specific age, okay? Because of what they also promote as in their, there's a lot of visual imagery around it in what they promote as a user. In other words, I cannot see myself in any of the templates, the story templates that Instagram has produced for users, okay? I cannot see myself. I see people who are 30 years plus younger than me, right? Having fun rather than being miserable at home, wearing slippers. So there's a difference. Now, to go back to your question, though, in terms of, for instance, online tech magazines, who reads them? I'll tell you who reads those. Software engineers, who on the basis of review and then on the back of their surveys, market surveys, look to improve, work on a feature, add another, blah, blah, blah. So a professional market that is part of the company. And also we found, and that, to be honest, I had not anticipated in advance. We found that businesses read those things, and businesses are incorporating now how-to guides about producing great stories as part of their marketing advertising strategy, which really brings together to a surprising for me degree, because I had not anticipated that, business, marketing, advertising with stories. And that was, if I could say, you know, one of the most surprising things about this corpus, in the sense that business and marketing language generally came up as a salient theme as well. And with my qualitative analysis, I had not identified that. So in a way, and to have another go at your question, if I can answer it, in a way, I'm still looking with this, I'm still prioritizing top-down discourses, addressing specific users. And yes, I still have no way of knowing exactly what those users will do with their stories. What I have a way of knowing, and I'm looking at in parallel, is what the really popular story users are doing with those things on social media. People like Kim Kardashian. And you know what? I'm often asked a question about social media, essentially, you know, how you... essentially it's a question about what you choose as data, how you choose your data, and the thing about social media landscape in terms of communication choices is that it still remains relatively uncharted. So there will be hopefully a point at which, with this line of inquiry, you'd have a parallel line of inquiry that looks at, some of our PhDs are working on these things right now, that looks at Snapchat stories by actual users, and maybe the two can come together, but it's still very, very uncharted territory. And stories as a feature, to the best of my knowledge, are very unresearched still.
Hello. I don't have a question. I have more like an observation, I would say. Yeah. But regarding the brands that use or that use stories as a medium to sell their products and use regular users, would you say that that's a regular user actually? Because there's a huge difference between a person that posts a story that has just about, 40 followers or 100 followers, and an influencer that has 2,000, 5,000 followers, 16,000, I don't know. Would you say that the practices that each group uses defines the user in a way, or would you say that brands use these users as extension of the brand, whereas we're telling that media is not extension of a person, but part of a person? I don't know if I'm making this point clear.
No, you're absolutely right. I think really that's where it's going. That's the kind of brave new world. Micro-targeting with ads has been about for a little time now on social media, and I think that is an evolution on this micro-targeting. It works with this idea of personalization, that what you see as ads when you are on social media is not, I don't know, prostate cancer, which pops up on my Facebook for whatever reason. It's not completely, you kind of don't think, it becomes so integrated into your whole experience that you kind of cease even to recognize it as an ad. And in fact, there are all kinds of other story facilities that encourage users to check out ads as well. So if you get a story, an ad story, when you're on Instagram, partly those ad stories are not conventional ads, the kinds of ads that will say, yeah, another ad, but they are story ads. Behind the scenes is a very common format that lots of companies use, that, this is not about our products. Come and look at us and our daily lives, moment in our company's life, okay, behind the scenes, or you're invited to leave this area that you're on now and actually go to the company's website to check out the rest of the ad. So there are some sophisticated ways in which both the story ad experience can come across as non-disruptive, to your experience, and also there's kind of more choice than before. But look, you don't have to put up with random ads popping up. And in a way, if you want, you can check us out further. Swipe for the full story, for instance. And then you have all those celebrities and followers, whereby they can blur effectively, as I suggested in the case of Kim Kardashian, the boundaries between my life and my product, so that it doesn't become necessarily an ad. It's not about Kim Kardashian is advertising her makeup line, which incidentally came out in 2017, exactly when she started using Instagram stories lots, okay?
Yes, because I have seen that the dialogue is different and the practices are different because users that have less followers tend to say, I bought, or I have, or I've seen, whereas influencers or celebrities turn to dialogue to you can have, you can buy.
That's
use my
interesting.
subscribe, follow me, like, use the code, visit my site, visit my advertisement. So these practices are kind of dictated by the company, whereas regular people don't have an editor of some sort.
That's very interesting. You know, this is the next step that we want to take with this corpus, well, to add to the corpus. This is the next step. We want to look at, you know, those choices that have come up as salient in the corpus so far, pronominal choices, for instance. We want to check them out in the stories and posts of specific influencers. That's it. And so I'll take a note of that. I'll let you know if we are finding something similar, because that would be interesting, because influencer as well suggests that actually you become part of the machinery of promoting specific ways of storing and being oneself. Now, to go back to the previous question of how can we make, do we need to, how can we make some of this talk with maybe specific actual users, you know, have a community of practice of users, go back to my selfie, you know, young women, you know, if they can indulge me with this, and with their actual stories. I'm not sure yet. I'm kind of debating this in my mind in terms of the extent to which the two can be brought together, because I also don't believe in kind of deterministic necessarily relationships. I don't think we are going to find, I don't know, Izzy, I'm a bit agnostic in terms of how you move from this to actual users. What lots of social media studies people, and those include sociolinguists at the moment, would do is small-scale surveys. I don't need small-scale surveys. I have the results, and we have included them in this, of large-scale surveys of what teenagers in different countries of the world think about stories, you know. So, or interviews, they're not going to, meta talk is not going to illuminate us. But to look at actual practices, it's very hard. Data collection of stories is very, very hard. Partly because they are ephemeral, and partly because users, not the celebrities, but they are reluctant to provide their stories to a researcher. Like when I was looking at selfies, they were very reluctant, and I never got any private messages from them. Sure.
Of course, I come from a generation which is far from all these.
I come from the same generation, don't worry. I only research these things. I don't post stories myself.
Right. Well, I was just wondering about the topic of the stories.
Yeah.
I mean, all these stories and celebrities seem to be always like happy and telling about, you know, how wonderful life is or their lives are. What about stories which, that's just a question. What about stories about, you know, political experiences? Yeah. Like, I was just thinking about the Me Too recently in the US. About women, I mean, we have now all this debate worldwide. Are there any stories about, you know, specific topics which are really like, you know, not just on the surface? Because I was thinking that all that about, you know, Kim Kardashian, very superficial kind of stories with likes and all that. But with critical discourse analysis, we deal with a lot of issues which are, you know, deep, bottom line issues, political, religious, social, critical, I mean, really hot issues that interest the society as a whole.
Yes.
Are there
Yes.
stories about that?
Yes, I'm sure there are stories like that, but I think that this kind of, I never thought I'd present myself as a critical discourse analyst. I don't think I am, but I think that this kind of work is at the heart of what a CDA project should be about. In terms of social media, there are stories like that, I'm sure, but this is about. But it's interesting then, if there are stories like that, it's interesting then that Facebook and Instagram are not actually putting those stories as part of their template stories. These are the stories you can tell, and it's interesting then that what they are privileging is having fun with the koala, bear thing. So this is where an analysis like this, I think in the tradition of CDA, can actually make a little more apparent some hidden and opaque discrimination and privileging of specific, as I said, lives and subjectivities on the part of social media companies. As opposed to, and to go back to that question, this is a similar question with the creative. Can't creative people do, lovely things with stories? But in the very difficult interplay between agency and structure, let's say, I would begin to see those things as resistances, or departures, as opposed to compliances with what is promoted as a standardized way of posting a story. And within resistances and departures, there are always compliance, you see, because I think, for instance, that the redesignation of stories as primarily visual activities is something that is taken up even by agentive, creative, resistant individuals. And that's interesting to me. Why would stories suddenly become visual activities as opposed to textual activities? Who decides that? On what grounds? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. These are fascinating things, also for theory, of course. I had several questions, but let's just limit it to some basic thing. First of all, because you have these huge corpora of stories, if you compare the basic narrative structure compared to, let's say, the classical Lebov and Walensky schemas, are these short online stories very different in structure? That's one question I would like to hear about, because you have so many data. You can maybe things, even narrative structures are changing. Or online, they are different from the everyday kind of stories people tell in everyday life. The second question is, you briefly in the beginning talked about identity. Now the question is, if people, what you say, sharing moments in these kinds of things, how much can you infer about identity, or what kind of identities are they? Are they social identities? Are just selves, unique identities? And if people want to brand themselves and let's say sell stories in the sense of many people will follow you, how much of identity is still there and not something which is getting so standardized that there is no longer some kind of real identity? There's more things, but that's not for now.
Great questions, big questions. I think my work on small stories, previous work on small stories on social media, along with other people's, I can think of lots, Ruth Page, Dasha Dieter, quite a few people have actually shown that on Twitter, on Facebook, with statuses, what you get is literally fits in the original definition of small stories, in the sense that you get a lot of here and now, mundane, breaking news, fragmented, types of activities. Sometimes you get what I have called narrative stance-taking moments, little moments of taking a stance, and then a story may develop, a story à la Labov may develop, may emerge contextually. So, so you definitely get different structures, and partly because the ownership of those activities is very different. There is multi-authorship in all cases. Even when you post something about your moment easily becomes our moment or becomes distributed. So the kind of personal ownership of activities is very disrupted. And of course, Labov was talking about past experience stories. And as I think I've argued today as well, the past is nowhere to be seen in those activities. There are blogs, there are other sites, less popular online, where you can reminisce. But this is definitely about sharing the here and now, which brings me to your second question of what are identities here. It's a good question. I think my answer, my attempted answer, was in one of the initial slides where I claim that we need to very much look at identities in relation to participation. So local participation, you know, the sort of Zimmerman discourse identities. What I'm doing is intimately tied up with the environment in which I'm operating, and what I can say or not say become very prominent here. And Zimmerman thinks about those identities as temporary and fleeting because they are so closely bound up with the situation. But he also says, and I think other conversation analysts would agree, that they can provide glimpses to us of perhaps larger extra situational identities. But I think so the idea of temporality and fleeting participation needs to be taken into account in any definition of identities here. And the other thing I'm bringing to the table is the close link between identities and sharing, and the economy of sharing. So does this take me to a view of identities as selves, as you said? It's interesting that you talked about selves. Some people actually don't even use the term identity. They are talking about subjectivities even. Subjectivities, which is, I don't know if that solves all of the problems, but it sort of prioritizes the self, the here and now self, in all kinds of different moods and positions, emoting, maybe sharing, you know, doing other things. More generally, I think that the idea of assemblage, which is being used now by social media analysts, is important here for identities, so that identities pick up, our identities online pick up all kinds of elements, and very heterogeneous elements that are loosely connected with one another. And some of them may have to do with our life offline, and some of them will have to do with semiotic affordances and modes, and with our participation. And that's what makes up the whole, if you're looking for a whole of an identity. But certainly we cannot talk about essentialist identities or real identities, despite the fact, as I said, that actually social media platforms themselves seem to be working with conventional definitions of identities.
It would be much closer to Butler's idea of performances of an identity, you know, things which all the time are being constructed and construed newly, and if it is each time showing glimpses of an identity, then you really have this difference between something more constant. You may be, you know, a linguist or British or something continuous on the one hand, and the way you perform it in every kind of different situation. And the typical communicative situation here is the situation online and public.
Yeah. There are sociolinguists at the moment who look at identities online with Goffman, and they make this distinction between front stage and backstage, and the dramaturgical approach. There are others who look at audience selection, how we select our audiences in terms of how we present ourselves, and performativity is very important. What I would say, and these are good ways, they are good ways to look at performativity of identities within the limits of the space of the affordances is a good way. What I would say that sometimes those studies are missing out on, and I'm not saying that I have the full answer to these things, is their connection with how we make sense of ourselves and the world around us online, which is the main imperative as to why we go online. We go online, as Mark Zuckerberg prescribed it many years ago, to share our moments and what we care about. And that already brings up to me a key link between processes of storing ourselves, however fragmented, storing ourselves, little plots, and identities. So I see the link between the two as of paramount importance online.
Fascinating, because all what you have told is also, at least for me, needs a new theory of context.
Yeah.
Because obviously the classical parameters of context are no longer so much relevant here. You talk about affordances and many other parameters, which, if you begin with contextual definitions with Delheims in the 60s until today, now we need a totally different kind of context for this kind of text and talk.
Yes, yeah, totally. And partly because the most influential, some of the most influential ideas that we have now about context originate in research, in face-to-face, quite confined 2, 3, 4 friends, interactional contexts. And this is very different. This is very different, both in terms of participation roles and addresses, but also, as you said, in terms of what public and private really mean online. Yeah. Thank you. Well, it's something for the next generation, hopefully, of linguists, of discourse analysts to grapple with, because we do need a new theory of context, I agree. And also, I'm one of those people who think, I don't like gratuitously putting on the table more and more terms, but I think when you go for a new theory, you do also need new concepts or reconceptualization of existing concepts. So there is some work now that looks at indexicality online. What is indexicality online? How are inferences made online? What is contextualization queuing online, for instance?
Okay, any other? I think we should stop here. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.